Welcome to Bold Talk series where creativity, leadership, ideas, innovation come together. My name is Epi Ludvik, and today I have a privilege to have a short one-on-one conversation with Jay Rogers, CEO and founder of Haddy. Jay, great seeing you, and welcome to our Bold Talk series. How are you, my friend?
It's been so long, man, and it's just great. I am great. I am very blessed to be both talking with you today, sharing some thoughts about what I've learned in this journey, and running the company and being part of the team that we have here today at Haddy. I feel just great.
Yeah, Jay, I still remember when we met in New York City with a mutual friend of ours. We introduced and we having lunch, and that was really amazing. And you were back then at the beginning of the journey of local motors. What an incredible, amazing, impressive company you have built at that time. And truly looking forward to have this conversation because a lot of people I would love to, in our community to come across the work that you do in innovation and how early you've been and just pushing that innovation to the next stage. So first, let's start with your background. You started Local Motors, but it was about 15 years ago, and now you are doing something similar, but on a manufacturing and design innovation. Is that right?
So I started the plan for Local Motors in 2004 as I was a Marine, and I started to write it in 2007. I launched the company, so it's almost 20 years ago, and 18 years ago. What I would say is that I was an accidental entrepreneur. I'm certainly an accidental serial entrepreneur, and the journey to be able to get to where I am today with the things that I've learned started when I was probably an infant, but certainly when I was 12 years old. And so I reflect on that a lot at the stage in my career and in my life where I am. For those that know me well, they know that a fundamental part of my life was growing up going around the world on a boat. At 12 years old, my father decided to shift and retire. And by retire, what that meant is to fulfill a life ambition to design a boat, build a boat, and then go around the world on that boat. And we as a family were brought into it, which taught me a lot about how to raise my boys now in terms of bringing them close to the things that I'm doing so that we can live a life together while we as adults and they as children are living their lives. And so that started for me. And designing a boat, building a boat, and living on a boat teaches you a lot about machines. It teaches you a lot about resilience. It teaches you a lot about good or bad planning, leadership of teams, and how humans integrate with machines. That's the way, at least, that I saw it. And so fast forward to the time in which I studied at Princeton, both international affairs and engineering, and then moving to China in the mid-90s, being able to learn how US and European and other nations, Australia, were shipping technology to China to teach manufacturing methods in what I would call the last generation of manufacturing for mass manufacturing was something that I was part of. It always bothered me how it was basically rooted in finding lower cost labor that depended on which industry you were in. You could have been in solar, you could have been in electronics, you could have been in telephony, you could have been in many different industries, including anything that could be shipped by sea. So not concrete, but basically other things. So I was part of that. I came back to the United States after the company that I worked for, which was a medical device company, where we did building and designing and creation and usage of machinery and chemistry. I came back to the United States. I worked in finance for a short period of time. And then, as you had mentioned, I joined the Marines, and I was going to go to business school, and I decided again in the accidental way to follow my gut toward learning how to lead better. And I'm so glad that I did, because in business school, I would have gotten very little of the training that I got as a Marine leader. And I ended up spending the best part of 8 years in the Marines. And from 1999 all the way through 2008, I was a Marine serving in various operation areas, generally in the Pacific and in the Middle East. And at the end of that time, or as it came to what would eventually be the end of my time in that, I realized that I wanted to take what I had learned, both in going around the world and working in China and being a Marine, to try to build a company or a set of companies. At the time, I would have said it was one company, Local Motors, to change the way in which big things were done. And for me, I was very interested in mobility. I've been interested in mobility since the time that people thought about making a car go on its own by strapping a brick to an accelerator. I've been interested in mobility from the time that people were predicting cataclysmic amounts of manure in New York City because everybody got around by horse and population was growing so large. Nobody saw the auto cycle coming in and ridding the city of cataclysmic amounts of manure. I'm fascinated by the way that the way we get around can change in an instant. And so now you see Waymos and other vehicles, Zooks and other versions of those types of things on the street, and they don't strap bricks to accelerators because we have been able to build up the building blocks of manufacturing and software and sensors and human systems to be able to get those things to change. So I was part of that in building a company called Local Motors, which started in 2004. And then we launched it, or the idea did. I wrote the plan while I was on reserves in the Marine Corps when I went to Harvard Business School. And then I founded the company in 2007, and I ran it all the way through 2019. And at that point, a lot of things changed for me. I owned very little of the company because of the amount of capital that needed to be raised. And so I lost control of the business. That is something that happens when you don't have control of a business, financial control. I had moral control of the business, which was a very tough place to be because I was the sole holder of the business, but I didn't own enough of it to control it. And so basically what that meant is it meant that I got shoved out by people who, I always express the best intent, even if you don't always know it, by who wanted things, even if they didn't know what they were inheriting in terms of what it would take to get there. So unfortunately, the people that took over the business were not able to keep it in business, and it closed down shortly after I was pushed out. And that was very hard, not necessarily just on the legacy of the company, but all of our customers and on our team and on our factories and the promises that we made in the future. And so before I talk about what that led me to now, what I would say is it taught me a lot of things. It taught me that on the journey to autonomy for vehicles, there have been so many people that have slayed dragons to get there. People like Henry Ford and Edward Deming and Frederick Taylor, who slayed the dragons of manufacturing and brought processes like S or 6S with Sakichi Toyota and Teiichi Ono and those kinds of things. Those were necessary building blocks and dragons that needed to be slayed. And then all the way through all the work that unsung heroes like, Chris Urmson and, Larry Page and Sergey Brin and, Tim Kentley Clay and, basically like innovators and corporate folks and scientists, logisticians, all people who have had, I could list thousands of names, who have created next generation mobility that today will result in better mobility for people. So Local Motors played a part in that. And I played a part in Local Motors, a leading role. And so when in 2019, I became a past entrepreneur for that, I had to really think about what was going to happen next. And one of the things I did was get back to the touchstone of like, what did I love? What would I love to get up in the morning and do? And so leadership is something that I love. I love the hard parts about it, the fun parts about it, all of that. And so I knew that was clear to me. I wanted to lead something. And I just will note for those people that are taking this in that to me, one of the first things in leadership is learning how to follow well. And so like learning how to listen and learning how to be humble. Leadership doesn't have to come from the front. It can come from the back. And so I did a lot of listening, and I also realized that I loved digital manufacturing. And I felt like the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning was steaming forward as it became possible to think about a generative pre-trained transformer and thinking about how language could be tokenized and used to make predictive models that could eventually begin to approximate and then supersede what a human brain can do to assimilate learnings in parallel processes. That was fascinating to me. But what was more fascinating to me was how we would imagine rebuilding the world like we were printing cars at Local Motors without doing it the old way. Low labor costs, things that were difficult and hard and created needs for unions and protections and other things like that. So I started to research and spent 2.5 years researching how to build the future robotics business that could make things the way we had started making them at Local Motors. In about 2022, I launched Haddy, and that was pointed at the time to the furniture market, $700 billion market globally that was very focused on slow moving global supply chains, generally backed by low cost labor and shipping. And so most furniture in the developed economies is made in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. And so we wanted to change that. We always knew from the exact outset, for a guy that had started by 3D printing cars, that a business like this was going to be capable of printing much more than furniture. That's often a twist that people miss. Like, we weren't accidental about starting a company that would print the world. We already knew we could. We just backed up and started to work on things that were slow moving, didn't have a lot of supply chain intensity from a point of view of number of suppliers, just one supplier, the nation of Vietnam, and the trees that they cut down. And so for me, and I'm being a little bit coy, because there are things that are sustainably done in Southeast Asia. It's just like there are good forests of Ipe that are harvested and other things like that. It's just that it's not sustainable to pack cartons, containers full of furniture, 20% of which breaks, all of which has to go to a warehouse, all of which travels 16,000 miles in the United States just to get to a port to be transshipped or rail. That just slows down innovation. And it causes consumers who are shopping on Instagram to get something that's 52 weeks old because it can't move at the pace of software. In 2022, I launched that business and Haddy became born. And so what you see on my chest, if you can see this, would be, heroic, agile, kind, durable, and yours. And so for us, our journey was about building a company that was heroic. And in the end, all the way to the why, it was an enterprise business that could use robotics that were fed by machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to print the world faster and more efficiently. So that's my story in a nutshell. I know it's a mouthful, but there you go.
It's a great story because, you've gone through all different stages, and thank you for sharing that. Now, you mentioned about the leadership. That's one of the main things what your next started with the Hattie. And let's go back a little bit with the, when you were as Marine, you were commanded over 200 Marines, and now you're leading teams of innovators and designers. What lessons from military leadership do you bring into building culture and teamwork at Hattie? And how different that is from what you were doing with Local Motors?
The first question, or last question first. Not different than what I was doing at Local Motors, different stage. So at Local Motors, we eventually got to 300 families. And I don't just think of them as people, they all represented family units in one way or another, 3 different continents and 3 different factories. It was more distributed, but the team that we had was very focused on our enterprise customers, which were municipalities. They were difficult to deal with because they were much more corporate, much more hidebound by the need to keep the public trust. You don't hear that when you walk into a furniture enterprise. They don't say, we need to keep the public trust. They're not trying to keep people safe sitting on a couch for the most part. Whereas people putting mobility under the streets, they have to keep pedestrians safe. They have to keep people from being assaulted in an autonomous vehicle when no one is there to protect them. It's a more challenging job. And so building teams in that particular case was different in that way. But in the same way, Local Motors grew through being 1 to 2 to 10 to 30 to 100 to 300. And that got to the size that I had managed in the Marine Corps, which was, company leadership, as you mentioned, with several hundred people. So Hattie's back at the small unit size. But what's interesting about it in the small unit size is that we always believed in the Marines that, and organizational psychology proves this out to a great degree. There's just a limit to the number of humans on any network. You can improve that limit by using different, better networks as to how people can preserve the relationship of small unit leadership, intent, team, that kind of thing. I'm a big believer in decentralized operations, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But building a culture for us at Hattie, we have 15 people now. We started with 1, it was me. And then I co-founded with another prior member of Local Motors, then it was 2. And then we went up from there. And by the time we get to 30, I think we'll be at the size of our first full microfactory. And then we will, in the middle of next year, we'll have our next microfactory. So 1's a point, 2 is a line, and then 3 is a network. And so we'll get back to where we were with Local Motors, and then we're going to go much further. And so team building is getting from 0 to 30. And then starting to build replicating networks where the processes that are in each of those, where they're decentralized enough to run based on the backbone that they have, the digital data that they bring in, the digital data that they produce, and then each of them can continue to contribute to the network, but they run according to culture, principles, team building that happens at that size of 30 in that micro factory. And so it's a great journey to see. It's nice to be able to refine on what we did at Local Motors. I don't think we did it wrong. I think that there are ways where we could do team building even better. So I try to learn on those things. And so
Yeah.
there are core principles that we bring into that, but that's at least a scene setter of what we did to build team and where we're going right now.
Yeah. I mean, that's the always the and a continuous journey on the growing the culture and the leadership and so on, and the making sure that there's upskilling that never stops. Now, in terms of manufacturing in America, you look at like America has faced decades of challenge with outsourcing and cost. Now, how do you see Hattie's approach reshaping what made in the 21st century?
So when we think about what we would do in terms of being able to develop things and make, you talk about the decades. I mentioned briefly in sort of the introductory statements that in 1995 I was part of the move towards shipping manufacturing over to China, and that's about the time where the bulk of that happened, from big companies like Ford and General Electric to other new companies associated with chip manufacturing and permanent magnets and other things like that. So to reverse that decades long trend takes a long time. It does not happen overnight. And so America was not alone in that. I do think that a lot of the developed countries that shipped technology to Taiwan and then to China and then beyond China to Vietnam and other places for many industries did so in pursuit of corporate profits. They did it because they believed that as their standards of living grew, that it became more difficult to hold labor jobs and be a part of their functioning societies, like living in places where they could afford to live. So they needed to be able to change their balance of trade. And that meant change the way they built their economy. A lot more service jobs, a lot fewer manufacturing jobs. So I think that to reverse that trend is not the right way of looking at it. I think it is to leapfrog to the next manufacturing revolution. And so a lot of people use words like reshoring. We don't. We use words like local shoring. I think that manufacturing can evolve in China and in Vietnam and in the United States and in Western and Eastern Europe and everywhere at the same time with the tools that are available today. And so I think that will democratize access to built things much better. And so you didn't need to get a wireline phone in Botswana in order to be able to have telephony. You could go straight to a cell tower at the same time that those cell towers were being built in other places. Same thing. We don't need to reshore the way we made things in China in 1995, which was based on the way that we made things in the US in 1970. I think that you can actually democratize manufacturing globally through local shoring, regional shoring, and that has a lot to do with robotics.
Yeah.
So that's my view about how things get built in the U.S. and otherwise in the next coming decades.
Interesting. Jay, so somewhere you mentioned about like your company's motto is like alive in all rooms. What does that phrase mean to you personally?
For us, alive in all rooms really has a lot to do with every way you cut a facet of our business. It's about bringing the digital to the physical and then bringing the physical back into the digital. So I'll explain what that means, because to us, that movement is very alive. We're alive in chat rooms. We are alive in our microfactory. We are alive where our physical items become real in your rooms. But the things we make are very physical. They are very much in a space. It can be an outdoor space, an indoor space. It could be a commercial space. It can be a residential space, but it's a big vision, because when you think about the value of the built environment, everything that we make is in some sense to augment human lives. Whether it's a table to give you a place to eat dinner or put your arms on, whether it's a chair to sit down and take a load off, we simply exist in the built environment. Some of it is built organically, like a tree, and some of it is built out of concrete. There's things we drive on, other things like that. But we're constantly, the way I joke about it is taking a load off on something that we built. And so for me, being alive in the room means making those objects come alive, because oftentimes we just think about them as dead objects.
Yeah.
And so we think about our chairs that way, but they have a history. They have a long history. They have a design history, a manufacturing history, a supply chain history, all those things. And so when you become alive in all rooms, one of the things we do is we put a RFID chip in each of our pieces of furniture, so you can tap it with now the ubiquitous mobile devices that are out there, and you can learn the history, where it was made, what material it was made from, where that material existed before. In Europe, there's a movement toward a digital product passport, which I think is great. And I think that's really what it means to find out the live history, the family tree of something that you are around. And that's easily defined in a piece of furniture. It's a little harder to find when you think about making a building or a road, but you can still imagine it. And what really makes it come alive is when you tap something and the digital model comes up and you can put it on the floor next to the real thing. And you can see when you size it up and down and when you flip it around and then you email it to someone or text it to them or WhatsApp it to them and they say, wow, I can see it now in my space too in augmented reality. They use their same device that they got it on, laptop or phone or tablet, and then they can see what you sent them. And then they can take a picture of it. And so social selling and social sharing and things that are really alive is what Alive with All Rooms means to us.
Jay, this is great. Thank you for joining me in this Bold Talk series. Truly looking forward to seeing you again soon. I always like to ask as a last question to my guests in these podcasts, and that is about the word bold. What does that mean to you personally?
Great question. And so, I often think, maybe even I've said this to you in the past, like, I think that courage to me is one of my leadership traits and principles that I try to espouse. And it's interesting. I have 15 leadership traits and principles that I lead by. I could name them off by at any time in my sleep. It ends in things like vulnerability and it starts in things like judgment. But one of the ones that is really interesting to me is courage. And it's the only one of those 15 that I break into two segments because one is moral courage and then the other one is physical courage. And to me, when I think of, your title and being bold and the title of the series, and I think in the awards that you have and the other things like that, I often think about the courageousness that it takes for people to do things. What does it mean to be bold? It means to be courageous in my mind. But courage is about having the moral courage to stand up and do what you believe is right when no one else is looking or everyone else is looking. And that can be in entrepreneurship, it can be in faith, it can be in morality, it can be in ethics, it can be in lots of things. But those are the moral courages to be able to stand up and do those things that you believe to be right at the time when no one's watching. And then the other one is physical courage, and it's very different. You have to train yourself to get out of safety and to react in a way where your actions can be spoken for later, but the effect of those actions matter when they need to happen. You don't have time to think. And so physical courage is a totally different thing to train. And when I think bold, I think courage. When I think courage, I think moral and physical courage.
Amazing. Jay Rogers, so great to see you, man. I wish you great successes and really looking forward to have another great conversation, more in depth, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Until that time, take care, be great, and be bold always. Take care, my friend.
Thank you, Epi.